open further doors. And the stories are pretty grisly. Granted, it's a controversial story, but the human mutilation cases are certainly less than the cattle mutilation ones, which sort of literally run into the thousands. But the reports are very similar in terms of organs being removed and sexual organs, eyeballs, tongues, lips, that kind of thing. I talk about one that reached Leonard Stringfield, who was a long-time UFO researcher, but also a former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer, when reportedly a team of U.S. military personnel came across a landed UFO surrounded by a number of what were clearly alien creatures, reportedly loading human bodies and body parts into these large bins and then loading them onto the UFO. Stringfield went on record as stated that he didn't doubt the story. Stringfield said that he had no doubts about the person and trusted implicitly. And the major problem with the human mutilation issue is that it's very much under-investigated. Don Eckert, someone who was a high-ranking military source, did some good research on the subject in the late 80s and early 90s, but overall it's been ignored. It's just, I think, it's gone under most people's radar. A lot of people just don't realize it's a legitimate phenomenon. But I think, more digging, we might be surprised at what we turn up.
I remember Don Ecker, who's a friend and colleague, on a hard-nosed investigator. He had a case, I think it was in Idaho, a couple of hunters who found a body or something.
Yeah, you're right. This was actually it was between Bliss and Jerome, Idaho, in 1979. And it was two hunters. They came across the body of a man who was dead under very weird circumstances. He didn't look like he'd been sort of attacked by a bear or a mountain lion. It looked like expertise, skills had been used, if that's the right word, skills. He was missing both of his lips, one ear, and his sexual organs. And it looked like it had all been done with surgical precision. And, when you have rogue cases like that, it really does sort of push the subject down a very sort of sinister path.
Well, if you were wondering why there's no disclosure or why somebody doesn't come forward, maybe that's part of it. And it's not only an occasional mutilation here or there, but you got a heck of a lot of disappearances if you cast a wide enough net.
Yeah, and I think, if you look at the overall angle of UFO disclosure, I think, I support the people who are really doing the research into this and pushing to get disclosure.
Yep.
But I think, I often think that not much thought's given to what might actually be disclosed beyond the fact that aliens exist and maybe we've got a few bodies and crashed UFOs. The bigger issue of missing people, deaths, human mutilations, when the door is opened, if it is opened, I think some people may have wondered if we should have left the door shut. I think we should know the truth, but I think there could well be a lot of dark and disturbing things that come along beyond just, yes, we are being visited.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I fully believe in it. I strive for it. I work for it every day. But you know what? If the truth comes out that we are food or we're a farm, I'm not sure that people really are going to be ready for disclosure.
No, and I think this is the main issue, that if it was just that we'd had a few weird visits back in the 40s and something crashed, but they didn't attack us, now we've decided to tell you. I could see it coming out under those circumstances, but I think my personal view, speaking to people, is that something about the subject that's very disturbing has been learned and a decision has been taken. There's just no way we can tell people that,
We're on the same page. Going to Dave in Pittsburgh on the wild card line. Good morning, Dave. You're on with Nick Redfern.
Hello, I'm a first-time caller, but
welcome.
I could tell you a bunch of my UFO experiences, but since you're talking about the scientist, Terry passed away. Well, there was one that, I don't know if you mentioned it before, but he was the lead singer for Aaron Butterfly, which he was the physicist. He had developed a way to send a message to outer space and back at a quick time. And all of a sudden, he came up missing, and they found him in a desert in California. Well, they found his bones, actually.
Nick, does this ring a bell?
Yeah, it actually does. I don't know the full details, but the story was definitely written up in a UFO magazine a few years ago, and he was found dead, and he did have a tie to the UFO phenomenon, and it was an unusual story. But I'm sure if you put it into a search engine, you'll find it. But yeah, there were some UFO themes to the whole story. Yeah.
Appreciate the call, Dave. That would be pretty interesting if the lead singer of Iron Butterfly was a physicist. I'll throw out another name, Nick. It's a name that I get asked about all the time because of the possible connection to Area 51. It's Phil Schneider. Are you familiar with him? Because a lot of people say that the circumstances of his death, and I haven't investigated them, were pretty strange.
People ask me if I include Schneider's case in the book. I don't, not for any reason other than the fact that contractually I was limited to 65,000 words. I could not exceed that. I could have actually made the book like 90,000, but that's just one of those things. So, I was forced to, to leave certain things out that I could have actually put in. But Schneider's death, was a very weird one. But the interesting thing about Schneider was he was actually speaking quite openly about the Dulce story, Dulce, New Mexico, and the underground installations and, hostile extraterrestrials, and a lot of it tied in with the Paul Benowitz story that surfaced in the late 1970s with cattle mutilations and an underground facility at Dulce, New Mexico. And Schneider, his death was put down to suicide, but when you look into the intricacies of it, it doesn't appear to be a suicide at all. And that's interesting because, in terms of when it occurred, it's relatively recently. We're talking 1990s. We're not talking, 1940s or 50s. What this demonstrates is that things are potentially still going on in terms of unusual suicides, suspicious deaths, and so on. I think I've seen a trend where I don't think there are as many today as there were in the past, and I think that could well be because, as you pointed out earlier, George, how the subject's been diluted and sensationalized and so on, that there's no need anymore. And I think that's an interesting trend, that perhaps in the early years there would be more of motivation than there would be today, when it's become more part of popular culture and filled with disinformation and, unfortunately, hoaxes and whatever else.
Cooper is an example. Bill Cooper, I was the first guy to interview him on television, and I know how he died, and he sort of brought this on himself, but it wasn't because he was spilling beans on UFOs that he was killed. There is the risk of thinking anyone who's ever studied the subject who dies, it must be because of what they knew.
I was very careful as to what cases I used and which ones I didn't. And the most important thing is to note that, over the decades, there have been literally probably tens of thousands of people who've had an interest in the subject that's involved research or subscribing to journals or, signing up with MUFON or whoever, writing books, etc., etc. And they've lived perfectly normal lives. And I think there is a trend to these deaths, and I think it's where someone, if you look at the death of Forrestal and JFK, if the UFO connections to their deaths are legitimate, they would have been people in a prime position to reveal something of major significance. And I think there are other people, certain researchers, who may have been in a similar position as well, and like Morris Jessup. And I think it's those cases where somebody may have decided there was no alternative but to ensure that they didn't say anything again about anything at all. And on top of that, I think there are also certain cases where, for example, we talked about this sort of silent war that may have gone back in the 50s, where there was literally, so many aircraft disappearances and mysterious crashes that that's the reason we don't really see that anymore today, because I think the engagement has gone away. We've kind of got the message to stay away. So I think, that in terms of which deaths are suspicious and which ones aren't, we need to be sort of very careful. Somebody actually asked why I didn't include the death of a friend of mine, Matt Tonis, who wrote a book called The Crypto-Terrestrials a few years ago.
Yeah.
And one on the face on Mars called After the Martian Apocalypse. Mac died in his sleep at just 34 in 2009. Well, the reason I didn't include it was because Mac actually had heart disease. He had a number of experiences of faintings and dizziness a long time before he actually died, and he was trying to get treatment and so on. And then, unfortunately, he did die. So it's kind of like very occasionally, unfortunately, you see a footballer die on the pitch or during training, at 25 or something. It happens, and we're all human, and UFO researchers are human first. And sometimes a death is just a tragic death. But I think you're quite right, George, that a lot of people assume if there's a death in ufology, it's got to be sinister. But for the most part, they're not.
Well, we all go. I mean, we all go at one point. Yep.
Forrestal actually began working in the Pentagon on September the 23rd, 1947. That happened to be the same day that General Nathan Twine of the Air Force prepared one of the most now famous UFO reports or documents on UFOs, in which he said the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. Now, 24 hours after that, September the 24th, Forrestal met with not just President Truman, but a man named Dr. Vannevar Bush, who has been extensively linked with sort of secret UFO programs. And so, in other words, we do have like a timeline where Forrestal was mixing with key figures in the UFO field as it relates to the government. And so, although he didn't speak out publicly, we can place him with the right people at the right time.
The UFO topic has been so diluted by so much overload that there really isn't a whole lot of danger in talking about this stuff anymore, that whoever the bad guys are, they don't really care if you write a book or if I do a radio broadcast about it. Do you agree?
Yeah, I actually do, because, those of us who sort of report on it and talk about it, we're sort of on the outside looking in. I think the people who in the past at least had to worry were the ones on the inside who were thinking of coming out, like Forrestal, possibly like JFK, and also people like Morris Jessup, who stumbled on something that may well have, led to his untimely death. But yeah, I think in today's world of where ufology has now become part of pop culture, and on top of that, it's been diluted, like you said. It's case probably more that we kept an eye on, I would think, but not to the extent, where it takes on sinister proportions.
I'm gleeful in my agreement with you. Nick Redfern, it's always good to have you on the show.
Thanks, George.
I hope people will check out your book. Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind should belong in your UFO library. It's good stuff, and there's a lot of topics we didn't even touch on.